9:30 by my watch. Subcommittee on Highways and Transit will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purposes of an opening statement. Good morning. I want to welcome our witnesses today. Thank you for being here. The issue before us today is how do we ensure that we have the resources to build and maintain a surface transportation system that will meet the needs of our nation and allow us to remain competitive in the 21st century. As most here know, the Highway Revenue Act of 1956 created the Highway Trust Fund to provide a dependable source of funding for development of the interstate system. It was established as a user pays model. Highway users would pay excise taxes on fuel, which would be deposited in the Highway Trust Fund and dedicated to the construction of federal aid highways. Although subsequent acts of Congress increased taxes on motor fuels, imposed new taxes, and expanded programs eligible for funding through the trust fund, the basic construct remains in place today. Highway Trust Fund revenues come from transportation-related excise taxes. The majority of revenues, 84% to be exact, are from federal taxes on gasoline and diesel fuel, and 14% come from heavy-duty related truck taxes. The Highway Trust Fund currently finances most federal government spending for highways, transit, and highway safety programs. Since 2001, however, spending from the trust fund has exceeded revenue deposited into the fund. Beginning in 2008, the trust fund has relied on a total of $275 billion in transfers, mainly from the general fund of the Treasury, to remain solvent. Although critical to the Highway Trust Fund's short-term operations, government bailouts are not a long-term solution, nor do they address the underlying multifaceted and structural problem. First, the purchasing power of fuel taxes, which have remained unchanged since 1993, has eroded by 55% over the last 30 years. At the same time, funding authorized from the Highway Trust Fund for federal aid, highway safety, and federal transit programs has more than tripled. Additionally, more fuel-efficient vehicles and the use of alternative fuel sources have further eroded trust fund receipts. For example, electric vehicle drivers pay nothing at the federal level for their use of roadways. The Biden administration's desired CAFE standards could result in reduced motor fuel consumption of 200 billion gallons by 2050. That's billions of dollars in lost revenue, but not lost wear and tear on our highways. These factors have contributed to the widening gap between Highway Trust Fund receipts and expenditures. Meanwhile, the movement of freight on our roads and highways is expected to increase by 50% in tonnage and double in value by 2050. In terms of highway usage, vehicle miles traveled are projected to grow by 22% by 2049. At the same time, driverless vehicles and other advances in technology are going to change the way freight and passengers move throughout our transportation network. To keep pace with these developments, our system requires sustainable and reliable resources. Unfortunately, the current method of funding our federal transportation programs no longer meets those needs. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IJA, authorized $118 billion in transfers into the Highway Trust Fund to ensure the fund can meet its obligations until the law expires. Beyond the expiration of IJA in 2026, the Highway Trust Fund will once again go broke, requiring additional congressional action to provide solvency for the fund. We need to work together to reform the Highway Trust Fund to ensure that users who benefit from the system pay into the system. A long-term sustainable solution is necessary to provide state, local, and private sector partners the certainty they need to plan and build their projects. We need a solution so that we can build a modern and efficient transportation system to meet the needs of our 21st century economy. Our nation demands and deserves a system that will move people and goods safely and efficiently, expand opportunities across all communities, enhance American prosperity, and ensure American industry and innovation continue to lead the world. Our witnesses will offer potential solutions and discuss innovative new approaches for funding our surface transportation programs. I thank them for appearing before us today. I now recognize Ranking Member Holmes Norton for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, and I would like to thank our subcommittee chair, Rick Crawford, for holding this hearing on the status of the Highway Trust Fund. For decades, the Highway Trust Fund has provided a predictable and stable funding source for the construction and maintenance of roads, bridges, transit, and bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. Transportation projects take time to plan and build. Having a dedicated revenue stream, largely supported by the tax on gasoline and diesel, has allowed Congress to provide states, cities, and transit agencies with the certainty they need to plan and deliver transportation projects. However, because the gas and diesel taxes are flat taxes that have not been adjusted in 3 decades, the purchasing power of that revenue stream has eroded. Improved vehicle fuel economy and the increased adoption of zero-emission vehicles also represent an emerging challenge Congress will need to address. Congress needs to find a solution for the long-time solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. That would mean increasing user fees, or indexing them to inflation. It also might mean transitioning to a new system based on vehicle miles traveled, which several of our witnesses are piloting at the state level. Whatever Congress decides, we need to ensure that our solution meets several criteria. First, we need to provide a sustainable revenue source for the Highway Trust Fund that allows this committee to continue to enact multi-year surface transportation bills. States, cities, and transit agencies cannot build cohesive and functional transportation systems if they do not know how much funding they will receive year to year. Congress must continue to provide that certainty. Second, we need to continue investing in public transportation. Cutting federal support for transit would be catastrophic, not just for transit riders, but for drivers as well. Last Wednesday, here in the National Capital Region, which I represent, Metro carried 440,000 riders on its rail system alone. They have been carrying nearly 400,000 riders each weekday on their bus network. Imagine if even a fraction of those 800,000 transit riders had been forced to drive instead. Everyone would lose out from more gridlock, more pollution, and more time wasted in traffic. We must continue to guarantee strong federal transit funding. Third, we need to continue building for the future. With the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress took steps to address challenges that have been an afterthought for far too long. We created the first ever highway formula program to reduce carbon pollution. We established 2 new programs to redress the harms caused to neighborhoods that were divided by highways and bear a heavy burden from pollution. We created the Safe Streets and Roads Act for all grant programs to provide safe and reliable transportation choices for more people. Those are not luxuries. Those are essential to building modern-day transportation systems that work for all people and road users and address the challenges of the 21st century. Addressing the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund is not an easy task, but it is an essential one. I look forward to hearing the recommendations and insights from our witnesses today, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlewoman, and at this point I would recognize Full Committee Chairman Sam Graves. Although he was unable to join us today due to a schedule conflict, I ask unanimous consent to insert this letter into the record on his behalf. The letter dated October 18, 2023 is signed by a coalition of 24 stakeholders across industry and emphasizes the importance of finding a long-term solution to Highway Trust Fund solvency, including the exploration of a national VMT pilot program. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member Norton, for having this hearing today. Today's hearing on the State of the Highway Trust Fund is an opportunity to discuss a critical responsibility that faces this committee. How do we ensure a continued, shared, reliable, and robust funding package for surface transportation projects across the country in the future? States, local governments, tribes, and transit agencies rely on the certainty of funding from the HTF to plan and build road, bridge, and transit projects that support the economy, connect people to jobs, and provide safe transportation. Today's hearing is titled Running on Empty because revenues into the HTF have been insufficient to support bipartisan infrastructure priorities and investment levels set by Congress since 2001, as the chair noted. As a result, Congress has transferred $275 billion from the general fund to the HTF since 2008 to maintain the system of federal support for state and local transportation projects, a system that's been in place since the 1950s. Revenues have not kept pace with investments because Congress last acted to raise the federal gas and diesel taxes, the main sources of revenue for the Highway Trust Fund, back in 1993, 30 years ago. If the federal fuel taxes were indexed, the current rate for gasoline would be over 37 cents per gallon, and diesel fuel would be at nearly 50 cents per gallon. So it's no surprise that we can see the purchasing power of this revenue has deteriorated for over 3 decades. So while the future of the trust fund needs thoughtful consideration, cutting investment in infrastructure is not an option. The bipartisan infrastructure law marks the largest investment in transportation infrastructure since the founding of the interstate highway system and the creation of the trust fund. And we cannot have a big league economy with little league infrastructure. That's why we enacted the BIL to respond to decades of underinvestment at the federal level. Just last week, the Federal Highway Administration announced over $60 billion for roads, bridges, and safety projects distributed by formula to states, so every state in the country sees a direct and demonstrable benefit from the fund. So I'd encourage all members to call your governors and tell them to get that money spent and jobs created in your districts. Even as the federal government operates under continuing resolution, however, dedicated revenues from the trust fund made that announcement possible. This kind of consistent investment should be the norm and not the exception. And thanks to the continuity of the trust fund, states, local governments, and tribal governments go into every construction season with the certainty needed to move ahead on planned projects without delay. In the coming decades, with anticipated increases of population and demand for freight transportation, sustained and predictable investment in our infrastructure and in safe mobility will only grow in importance. In the next surface transportation reauthorization, Congress will have to decide how to fund transportation investments and whether or not to adjust the sources and levels of revenue that go into the Highway Trust Fund. The bipartisan infrastructure law directed the Department of Transportation to establish a pilot program evaluating a national motor vehicle mile per mile user fee. The BIL also updates and continues a grant program for state-level user fee pilot programs. And just as a matter of history, in 2007 in one of these iterations of transportation legislation, we passed a bill that included the Transportation and Revenue Commission that came back and recommended a vehicle miles traveled fee. So that was 16 years ago by my math, and we're still treating this as a pilot program. So my home state of Washington has established a pilot program to test and analyze a road usage charge, or a RUC, for vehicles as an alternative to gas tax. I'm happy to have Rima Griffith, the executive director of the Washington State Transportation Commission, which runs the Washington State's RUC program, here to share some lessons learned with the committee. States across the country are taking action to increase revenue to fund transportation projects. 31 states have approved plans to increase revenue through additional bonds, fuel taxes, vehicle registration fees, and tolling. Additionally, at least 33 states assess annual EV fees ranging from $50 to $225. Although EVs are not the cause of the trust fund insolvency, but as they become more prevalent, we will need to decide how to incorporate them into a user pay system. And the states continue to explore options to fund investment. We can learn from these efforts. So one more history lesson for me, I guess. Back in 2015, I observed that our country's transportation funding is running on empty. Without predictable federal transportation investments, we slammed the brakes on creating jobs and growing our economy. 8 years later, I continue to appreciate the sentiment and the urgency with which we must continue to press for a long-term transportation funding solution, and that we carry that forward in today's hearing. So I really do thank the chair and the ranking member for getting this together and getting this started and thinking about this for the next go-around. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields, thank you. And I want to welcome the witnesses first by saying thank you for your flexibility and your graciousness to help us start early as a result of the pending floor schedule. And with that said, we are on a hard stop at 11. So I would ask you to closely observe the lights in front of you. As you know, just like when you're driving on the road, when it's green, you're good to go. Turns yellow, step on the gas because it's fixing to change. And I would also say, I would also say that in the context of our hearing today, less is more. Mr. Chris Strickler, Director of Oregon Department of Transportation, Dr. Chad Shirley, Principal Analyst at the Congressional Budget Office's Microeconomic Studies Division, Mr. Jeff Davis, Senior Fellow from Eno Center for Transportation, and Ms. Rima Griffith, the Executive Director of Washington State Transportation Commission. Thank you, one and all, for being here, and Mr. Chris Strickler, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chair Crawford, Ranking Member Norton, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the Highway Trust Fund today. My name is Chris Strickler, as mentioned, and I'm privileged to serve as the Director of the Oregon Department of Transportation, as well as sit on AASHTO's board, representing the State Departments of Transportation of all 50 states, as well as District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. I extend AASHTO and ODOT's utmost gratitude to you and your colleagues on the subcommittee for your dedicated leadership on surface transportation policy through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Stable and long-term policy and funding provided through the robust multi-year federal surface transportation bill remains crucial for state DOTs to improve safety, mobility, and access for everyone. At ODOT, our priorities are to provide a modern transportation system, advance equity, and, very relevant for today's hearing, secure sufficient and reliable funding to accomplish these goals. ODOT, along with all other state DOTs, are experiencing funding challenges due to reductions in gas tax revenues, and like the Federal Highway Trust Fund, we are running on empty. The Highway Trust Fund serves as the primary mechanism by which the federal government provides resources to states, local governments, tribes, and transit agencies for highway and transit investments. Bills like the IIJA provide contract authority for several years at a time, giving state DOTs the funding certainty to plan and manage the program into the future. In Oregon, this federal funding has allowed us to address safety improvements, preserve the state of good repair for both our rural and urban transportation network, make our transportation system more resilient to natural disasters, and address transit needs in our small communities across the state. But the trust fund once again faces a fiscal cliff. At the expiration of the IIJA, and since 2008, revenues have not kept pace with the expenditures approved by Congress. And more than $275 billion has been transferred into the trust fund from the general fund during this same time. Why this happened is relatively straightforward, as the purchasing power for the trust fund has declined substantially. Federal fuel taxes are flat and have not been adjusted since 1993, and have therefore lost more than half of their value over the last 30 years. While the gas tax has not increased at all between 1993 and 2022, college tuition has gone up over 460%, and the cost of healthcare has risen by 280%. We need to find a long-term solution, and my written testimony includes a matrix that demonstrates a universe of options that might be available. With fuel taxes losing their buying power, Congress is now exploring a user pay approach that charges people based on how many miles they drive rather than how much fuel they buy. This modernization is necessary to put the focus back on the actual use of the system rather than just the consumption of fuel. Oregon was the first state to create a gas tax more than a century ago. And we are once again at the forefront of road usage charging, launching the nation's first pilot project in 2006 and the first operational road usage charge, or RUC, program in 2015. We call our program ORGO. Our program demonstrates a new way to fund road maintenance, preservation, and improvements. Volunteers pay a per-mile charge and receive a credit for the fuel taxes they pay at the pump. In 2017, our state legislature demonstrated their understanding of the revenue problem and their leadership by establishing supplemental registration fees for hybrid and electric vehicles to ensure that those highly efficient vehicles that use little or no gas contribute their fair share to the state system, or these vehicles could simply join ORGO. We appreciate that concerns have been raised about the equity of road usage charges. We've seen data that rural residents tend to drive longer distances and use less fuel-efficient vehicles and thus pay more in the gas tax today than their current counterparts. Under a RUC, rural residents likely wouldn't pay much more than they do in a gas tax, and urban residents who tend to drive more efficient vehicles would likely pay a little more. A road usage charge is a fair way to ensure that all vehicles pay for their use of the roads. I also can't emphasize enough that user privacy is a critical component of Oregon's program. ODOT never receives location data on any vehicle, receiving only aggregated and anonymized data. Our volunteers can choose a GPS base or non-GPS option to help determine their road use. We have partnered with private sector account managers who are responsible for administering individual transactions. And by statute, this data must be destroyed within 30 days of account settlement. Also, law enforcement must obtain a warrant in order to access that data. The trajectory of the Highway Trust Fund, which is the backbone of the Federal Surface Transportation Program, is unsustainable. Given its foundational role in funding highway and transit investments in every corner of the country, AASHTO looks forward to assisting Congress in finding a viable set of revenue options to ensure continued investment in our future through transportation. And I thank you again for the opportunity to provide testimony.
Well, I want to commend Mr. Strickler for his comments that the yellow light's not working, and he was still able to come in under time and under budget. So thank you so much for that. I would also like to extend my apologies to Representative Hoyle for overlooking her, and thank you for your grace. And because of the time constraint, thank you for your understanding. Now move to recognize Dr. Shirley for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Norton, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the invitation to testify. Today I want to focus on the outlook for the Highway Trust Fund and the imbalances between spending and revenues for highways. For many years now, the federal government has been spending more each year from the Highway Trust Fund than the revenues credited to the fund. The revenues come from taxes on gasoline and diesel fuel and various taxes that apply to heavy trucks. To cover the shortfalls, lawmakers have transferred $275 billion to the trust fund, mostly from the Treasury's General Fund, over the past 15 years. Much of that was authorized 2 years ago as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. With that recent infusion, CBO projects that balances in the fund will last until 2028. If balances in the highway account or the transit account go to zero, the federal government can't make its payments to state and local governments on a timely basis. And by 2033, which is the end of CBO's 10-year budget projections, the cumulative shortfall would be $241 billion. So looking ahead, spending and revenues are out of balance. Most federal highway spending takes the form of grants from the trust fund to state governments to build new roads or rebuild existing ones. CBO projects highway spending from the trust fund to grow to an average of $65 billion a year through 2033. Increasing spending before 2028 or continuing projected spending levels past that date will require more revenues for highways than the $37 billion a year expected through 2033. Revenues ultimately come from the people who use the highway system or taxpayers. So one way lawmakers could increase revenues is by charging users of the highway system more. Doing that could help allocate resources more efficiently. Highway users are responsible for many costs that they do not pay fully, including wear and tear on roads and bridges, traffic delays caused by congestion, fatalities, injuries, and property damage from accidents, and harmful effects from greenhouse gases and local pollutants. One option is to charge highway users more would be to increase the existing taxes on gasoline and diesel fuel. Those taxes haven't increased since 1993. For instance, an increase of 15 cents per gallon would raise about $25 billion a year. That would cover the Highway Trust Fund's projected shortfall over the next 10 years. Another option would be new taxes on highway use, such as a tax on vehicle miles traveled. Each penny per mile driven by commercial trucks, for instance, would raise about $3 billion a year, once the practical steps to implement it were in place. Implementing a new tax like this would cost more for the government than raising the gas tax, and it could raise privacy concerns if applied to personal vehicles, depending on how it was implemented. Third option would be to raise a new tax specifically on electric vehicles. In 2022, about 3 million electric vehicles were on the road, representing 1% of the stock of cars and trucks. Even with substantial growth projected in EV sales, the stock of vehicles turns over slowly. A $100 annual fee on EVs would raise an average of $2 billion a year over the next 10 years. Lawmakers could also increase revenues for highways by continuing to make transfers from the general fund or to spend directly from it. That spreads highway costs more broadly across taxpayers. Transfers financed by more federal borrowing would increase federal deficits. Using borrowed funds would boost GDP at first, but it would also reduce the amount of money available for private investment, dampening GDP in later years. Last, let me say a few words about financing. The federal government also subsidizes the financing of highway spending by state and local governments. Through tax-preferred bonds, direct loans and loan guarantees, like TIFIA, and funds used to capitalize state infrastructure banks. State and local governments used $23 billion in today's dollars the federally subsidized borrowing for highway spending each year, on average from 2007 to 2016. Tax-exempt bonds accounted for about 3/4 of that total. Financing allows state and local governments to pay for highways over a period that more closely matches the useful life of that infrastructure. Financing can be particularly attractive when a government does not have funds available for a desired investment. However, financing is not a source of revenues. It is a means of making future revenues available sooner. Let me stop there, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Shirley. Mr. Davis, you're recognized.
Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Norton, members of the subcommittee, my name is Jeff Davis. I'm a senior fellow at the Eno Center for Transportation, a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank founded by traffic pioneer William Eno in 1921. I've been studying the Highway Trust Fund since 1996, and I sat through the markups of the 1998, 2005, 2012, and 2015 surface transportation laws in this very room. The Highway Trust Fund was created by Congress on July 1st, 1956, to reassure the House members who had defeated the 1955 interstate bill that the taxes levied by the revised 56 legislation would be held separately from general revenues and would only be spent on specific highway programs, the user pay, user benefit principle. From that date and through August 31st, 6 weeks ago, the trust fund has received $1.392 trillion in user tax receipts and interest, 83% of which came from motor fuel taxes, and has paid out $1.537 trillion in outlays. This is a cumulative user pay deficit of $145 billion, which Congress has met with general fund transfers. I've got a chart here that shows that after the final bailout transfers, the green columns are the bailout, the blue are actual tax receipts and interest from users, are spending 28. The CBO baseline spending levels, the trust fund will run deficits exceeding $40 billion a year. How did we get here? 3 reasons. First of all, the average rate of increase in vehicle miles traveled declined. During the glory days of the interstate in the 50s and 60s, VMT grew about 4.5% per year, doubling every 16 years. That rate has dropped so that in the last 20 years, the average increase is only 0.8% per year, below inflation. VMT increases were no longer enough to keep receipts high enough to keep pace with inflation. 2, Congress enacted laws mandating more fuel-efficient vehicles. In 1976, the average passenger car on the road burned 7.2 gallons of gas for every 100 miles driven. That's now down to 4 gallons of gas for every 100 miles. SUVs and pickup trucks, they were 9.3 gallons per 100 miles. Now they're down to 5.6. It was a feature of federal energy and environmental policy to reduce the number of gallons used, but it was still a feature of federal transportation policy to base transportation spending on the number of gallons used. The environmental and energy policy and highway policy have been at war with themselves for decades, and the trust fund finally paid the price. And 3, Congress and the President have been collectively unwilling or unable to reconcile receipt levels with spending levels. What to do now? Policymakers need to ask 3 questions in order. The first is philosophical. Should the federal government bother to retain the user pay system for surface transportation? From a truth in budgeting perspective, you should either mend it or end it, make it self-sufficient on user charges once again, or get rid of the trust fund and turn those 5 taxes over to the general fund and everyone go line up at the appropriations window every year. But that would mean this committee would have much less to do. So if you decide to keep the user paid system and the trust fund, then ask yourselves a strategic question. What share of surface transportation programs should users pay, and which specific programs should users pay for versus general taxpayers? Should user taxes be prioritized towards capital or operation and maintenance? Towards large multi-year projects or smaller annual projects? Strictly to national needs or a mix of national and local? And should the relative benefit to the user be considered? At the end of this process, the goal is to get to a number, how much money you want to spend based on taxes from users. And then once you have that number, you can ask yourself the third question, tactical. If you keep the user pay system, how do you raise whatever number of revenue you're looking for from highway users? The gas tax isn't dead yet, but the yields are going to drop each year, and the political appetite to raise the gas tax is appearing to be lacking. States have taken the lead in testing new user pay options by testing ways to charge vehicles by the mile traveled, a VMT fee, also called a mileage-based user fee, or a road user charge. These are promising. The IIJ has mandated that DOT and Treasury conduct a 50-state pilot program to test a VMT fee at a federal level, and they put $50 million in money towards this. However, DOT is almost 2 years behind schedule getting this pilot program started. And if Congress chose to adopt such a fee at the federal level, there would be significant collection costs. I go into detail on this in my voluminous written testimony. In the interim, if Congress does decide to keep the user pay system, something has to be done to ensure that electric vehicles pay their fair share of costs incurred by their road use. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Ms. Griffith, you're recognized. Can you hit your microphone, ma'am?
Is it working now? Okay. Chair Crawford, Ranking Member Norton, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Rima Griffith, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Washington State Transportation Commission. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the future of transportation funding and the work Washington State has done on assessing a per-mile road usage charge as a replacement to the gas tax. Vehicle fuel efficiency is on the rise, and alternative fuels are advancing, leading to decline in fuel tax revenues. In Washington State, where the gas tax is constitutionally dedicated for highway purposes, forecasts indicate our gas tax revenues will decrease 50% per mile driven by 2040. Facing this trend, our State Transportation Commission has concluded that we must end our reliance on the gas tax and transition to a road usage charge, or RUC, where drivers pay by the mile rather than by the gallon of gas for their use of publicly owned roads and bridges. We've spent over a decade assessing, researching, and testing road usage charging to ensure our transition away from the gas tax is informed and deliberate, approaching it like a slow turn of a dial rather than the sudden flip of a switch. Our research shows we will need approximately 10 years to methodically transition our statewide vehicle fleet from paying the gas tax to paying a road usage charge. Our research has uncovered many findings. Perhaps the most important one is that road usage charging is fairer than our current gas tax. It levels the playing field, and it ensures all drivers, regardless of their car type, MPG, or fuel source, pay their appropriate share for using the roads. In doing so, road usage charging restores the simple principle of user pay, user benefits that the gas tax once embodied. While most don't think about it this way, we are paying by the mile today under the gas tax. We just aren't paying the same per mile rate. With wide-ranging vehicle fuel efficiency, drivers could be paying nothing for the roads through the gas tax, or they could be paying up to 5 or even 6 cents per mile under our state's 49.4 cent per gallon gas tax. Another key finding from our research is that the lower income households and rural drivers are paying more in gas taxes today than they would pay under a road usage charge. This is largely due to the fact that on average, these drivers tend to drive lower MPG vehicles, meaning they are likely paying in excess of 3 cents per mile today under our state gas tax. Under a flat RUC rate of 2.4 cents per mile, which is what is being considered in Washington State, they would see a tax reduction. For drivers of fuel-efficient and zero-emission vehicles who are paying very little, if any, gas tax today, paying a road usage charge is not a disincentive for them. In fact, these drivers will continue to maintain significant operating cost advantages compared to those driving less fuel-efficient cars when we factor in the cost of fuel and the need to frequently fill up. Also in Washington State, EV owners who pay a road usage charge will no longer have to pay the state's annual $225 EV fee, and hybrid owners will no longer have to pay the $75 annual hybrid fee, which is on top of other state and local registration taxes. Federal investments in state research and testing through the Surface Transportation System Funding Alternatives Grant Program, and now the Strategic Innovations and Revenue Collection Program, have enabled states across the country to pilot test and demonstrate that road usage charging can work and can serve as transportation's next sustainable funding source. And states are moving forward. The states of Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Virginia have enacted road usage charging programs. Vermont is in process, and Washington State will be considering legislation in the near future. The partnership between the states and the federal government to maintain our interstate highway system and other critical infrastructure depends on reliable, long-term funding generated by users of the system. The attention Congress is giving this topic today, coupled with investments in ongoing research and preparing for a national road usage charge pilot, is exactly what is needed to help our nation navigate to a more resilient, fair approach to funding our service transportation system. Thank you.
Thank you all for your comments. Ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statements be included in the record without objection. So ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. Also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by the members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. And finally, ask unanimous consent to reduce member questioned time to 3 minutes to allow more members questions. Without objection, so ordered. With that, I would recognize myself for 3 minutes. Mr. Strickler, Ms. Griffin, about 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and our economic situation is exacerbated by the persistent inflation that we're experiencing right now. I'm concerned that an annual or even quarterly vehicle mile traveled or road usage charge would cause more harm to lower-income individuals. Understand that many believe that lower-income individuals pay less under RUC, but the timing of RUC bills may be a problem. How many low-income individuals have participated in your programs thus far?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Again, Chris Strickler, Oregon Department of Transportation. I don't have the data, but I can certainly get it for you for how many low-income users are a part of our RUC program right now. But I can tell you that low-income users of our system in general is a priority for ODOT.
Gotcha, appreciate it. Ms. Griffith?
Thank you. We conducted a pilot of 2,000 drivers, of which a small percentage was considered low income. We have continued to do our research, though, deliberately reaching out to low-income communities and underrepresented communities across our state through focus groups and through interviews. We continue to get input from them, and through that education process, we have learned a lot around their challenges, but also what we can do to make sure it is equitable going forward.
So I'm concerned about what would happen if an individual couldn't fully pay off their RUC bill. Any considerations there?
Yeah, in Washington State, there are options and there are levers that policymakers don't have today with the gas tax. For example, with road usage charging, lawmakers could choose to cap the amount of total RUC charges a driver incurs each year. They could exempt certain levels of income from paying a RUC or perhaps offer a discount. These are options we don't have today under the gas tax. It's collected at a flat rate at the rack.
Thank you. Did you want to add to that, Mr. Strickler?
Yes, just a quick addition, Mr. Chair. In our program is voluntary, and so at this point, it's not a problem that we've experienced, but we understand the importance of it as well.
Okay, excellent. I'm in the interest of time, I'm going to yield the balance of my time and recognize Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Strickler, transit provides social benefits through reduced congestion and improved air quality, yet we have witnessed periodic attempts in Congress to eliminate the federal funding for public transit from the Highway Trust Fund, based on the argument that these funds should only go toward helping drivers. Would eliminating dedicated transit funding from the Highway Trust Fund help or hurt drivers?
Mr. Chair, Ranking Member Norton, thank you for that question. What we know about the transportation system is that each of the parts is intricately linked. And so the drivers rely on the users for the transit system and vice versa, frankly, in order to make the entire transportation system work, as well as our active transportation uses for bicycles, pedestrians, et cetera. So unequivocally, reducing the funding for transit agencies would hurt the overall transportation system and should continue to be part of the dialogue.
Thank you. Ms. Griffith, your testimony notes that the Washington State Transportation Commission has researched the equity impacts of road usage charges on lower income and underrepresented communities. How could road usage charges affect lower income individuals who already spend a disproportionate amount of their income on transportation costs?
Thank you. As I mentioned in my testimony today, those drivers are paying indeed a lot at the pump in gas taxes. Our research indicates that households less than $50,000 will see a reduction in gas taxes owed or in taxes owed. While modest, we estimate that it's around $7 per 10,000 miles driven. So while maybe not a lot, it is important when families counting every penny. We would also indicate that in our research, we did take a close look when we talk about quote-unquote transportation costs. What do we really mean by that? And what we learned is that households that make less than $30,000 per year, 40% of their total household cost is attributable to transportation. That is a significant portion of that household income. When we expanded and looked at what that transportation cost component was made up of, we learned that only 4% was attributable to gas tax or RUC, or equivalent RUC rate. 95% was attributable to the cost of owning a vehicle. So these are important takeaways for us as we think about making policy and looking at ways we can indeed help people who need some relief on the tax side as we assess the equity and impacts of a road usage charge.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. I yield back.
Gentleman yields, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Davis, I sponsored the Federal Infrastructure Bank Act with Congressman Allred, and it's referred to this committee. Its purposes is to provide infrastructure money in lieu of anything else that might be out there. So it would be non-federal money, non-tax money. It would just be free money provided by investments made by everything from, I guess, retirement funds to rich people. I don't know. But anyway, it would do that. But some community banks have said that they're concerned about competing with federal infrastructure bank. And so I just wondered, do you know any banks that loan to infrastructure projects right now?
In terms of actual financial institutions regulated by the Fed banks, no. There are several multinational wealth funds and things like Macquarie in Australia springs to mind that invest in these funds, but not banks per se. But there are large financial entities that do invest in these projects. However, loans have to be repaid, so there has to be a revenue stream from whether it's a toll or something else, to repay those loans in order to make them attractive to whoever's going to make the loan. And that's always been the problem, is that federal restrictions on tolling can hamstring the abilities of local governments to provide the revenue stream to repay infrastructure bank loans.
So if these banks were up and running, loaning money, creating jobs, all the things that happen when money's spent, don't you think that would complement the local existing banks that are there as opposed to deterring them from their regular business?
I don't see how regular banks, like whether your local bank or Citigroup, would have much conflict with a federal infrastructure bank. They're two different lines of business. But again, the federal infrastructure bank would have to loan to projects that would eventually be repaid, so there have to be a revenue stream somewhere. And also, the infrastructure bank relies on the federal government borrowing money at the lowest interest rate possible and then loaning it back out to people at a slightly higher interest rate. But as you've probably noticed, the federal government's borrowing costs aren't what they used to be even 2 years ago. So the interest rates have gone up to the point where you've got to take a step back and double check to make sure that some of the assumptions in infrastructure bank proposals from years past are still valid.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Gentleman yields, Mr. Larson.
Thanks, Ms. Griffith, thanks for coming today. In Washington State, our state constitution says gas tax has to be used for transportation. Is it, the commission looked at whether or not you move from a gas tax to something called a RUC? Is that an equivalent as far as the constitutional requirements in our state, or does that, I don't know if any other state has that issue, but have you looked at that? Whether or not we need to change the state's constitution to accommodate so that the money goes to transportation versus siphoned off by the legislature for general fund purposes?
Yeah, we have assessed that, and we believe that in order to ensure the same treatment of the RUC as we do gas tax, it would require a constitutional amendment. However, the legislature could codify in law, of course, provisions to protect those dollars for those intended purposes. But ultimately, we do believe they would have to do a constitutional amendment if they wanted to have it in the same requirement as gas tax.
Yeah, that which legislatures codify, they can decodify
Correct.
as well. Yeah,
Yes.
right. Happens around here sometimes. With regards to, you talked about disproportionate impacts. Has your pilot looked at rural versus urban or rural suburban urban impacts of the, looking at your 2,000 or so participants? Did you try to create a broad base of folks that would fit all these categories?
Yes, yes. Our pilot intentionally oversubscribed drivers in the rural parts of our states to ensure they were represented and could test and experience what a road usage charge would have in terms of the impact to their households financially as well as participation. So we were intentional about making sure they were very involved in that pilot.
Yeah. Now, we have the third highest gas tax of any state in the country or so. We also are tied for lowest income tax for those who question Washington State's tax system. So you're all welcome to move to Washington State and not have any state income tax. But given that, has the commission looked at the RUC as a complement, a supplement, a replacement to that gas tax because it's relatively high compared to other states?
Yes, so the legislature directed and has stated intent over and over that it would be a replacement to the gas tax. So as we contemplate a transition, a slow transition, where the gas tax would remain in place for some time, and I will note Washington State has leveraged its gas tax revenues quite heavily with bonds, so we do have a long runway in terms of repaying and defeasing those. However, when we think about that, we tested in our pilot, and we believe this would be the case in an actual program where drivers would continue to fill up at the pump and pay those gas taxes, but they would receive credits for the gas taxes paid towards their RUC charges. So in essence, drivers would see incremental payments being made towards those RUC charges, minimizing the bills that they would get or the balances owed on those RUC invoices.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thank you. You'll bet.
Gentleman yields, thank you. You okay with recognizing Ms. Chavez-Durima?
I got so lucky today. Thank you. Director Strickler, thank you for being here and representing Oregon. I think it only can be a benefit that there's other Oregonian in the House, Val, and so there's 3 of us in this room to get it figured out. So thank you. Mr. Strickler, Director Strickler, thank you for appearing before the subcommittee. As you know, Secretary Buttigieg came before the full committee last month, and it's no surprise that I'm going to spend my time today with ODOT's plan to impose tolling on Oregonians. You know I oppose tolling. We discussed many concerns when you visited my office in March, and since then, the list of reasons of tolling have grown. Mr. Strickler, I hope you took a few minutes to watch the exchange with Secretary Buttigieg regarding tolling. The Secretary emphasized the importance of following federal laws governing the process, and this includes conducting that meaningful public outreach. He stated that tolling must meet certain federal requirements for the U.S. Department of Transportation to sign off on it. I also wrote a letter to the Secretary to summarize how ODOT's tolling's rollout has deeply been flawed and mishandled. My letter recently relayed recent concerns from meetings with mayors, public comments from Clackamas County and other communities. So let's start with the environmental assessment for 205, or rather the draft EA, as it's technically called, issued in February. That EA firestorm of opposition from county and city leaders. They pointed out the congestion will not be resolved by tolling. Traffic will divert from the highways and nearby cities and county roads. These communities are not equipped to handle that increased traffic volume. Letters also raised questions about ODOT's modeling and the lack of cohesive mitigation strategy. There are concerns about accommodating those with financial hardships as well, not to mention hardworking Oregonians who are dealing with inflation in the economy. As of today, ODOT cannot unequivocally present the plan for tolling. ODOT has downgraded tolling on I-205 to just the Abernathy Bridge without a third lane, but we must wait for the supplemental EA for those details. And as for the regional mobility pricing project, there are multiple options still under consideration. I'm going to skip a couple of things because we're on limited time. So for the first question, does ODOT intend to officially respond to public comments on that EA for Clackamas County and the affected cities? And do we have to wait for that supplemental EA?
Chair Crawford, Congresswoman, we do intend to respond to the public comments as part of the EA process, and we continue to evaluate different options associated with each of the toll-related projects moving forward.
When can we expect to see ODOT to move past the various proposals and present the final tolling plan for I-205 and I-5?
Yeah, Congresswoman, at this point, as you know, the evaluation period going through the EA right now is really to gather that data, gather the public input, and to have the conversation with each of
Director Strickler, this has been going on since March. I really want to kill this bill, and I would expect that you're going to help me do that. With that, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Mr. Pappas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the comments of the panel here today. I think while we might not leave with all the answers, we certainly help us understand the problem and the questions that we can continue to refine as we do our work moving forward. Obviously, the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund is so critical to all of our states in ensuring that projects can continue to move forward. And I will also just add that on the other side of the ledger, as we think about equity and sustainability in terms of the revenue, we should also think about how we modernize the highway formula, which disadvantages a number of states, including mine, and that's something that we have to continue to focus on. Ms. Griffith, maybe I could start with you. I appreciate the ways in which the states have been laboratories on this issue because the same forces that are impacting the Highway Trust Fund at the federal level are obviously hurting our state budgets when it comes to transportation funding. One of the issues that I hear about in my state all the time is privacy and concerns around that. Could you talk about in your pilot how you work to address privacy concerns, and is that a hurdle that can be overcome?
Thank you for that question. Yes, it's been a focal point, an important point that we address, and we are ready to address it. It's largely solvable through an approach of offering drivers options for how they would participate in a road usage charge program, how they would remit their miles, essentially. You do not have to use GPS in order to do a road usage charge program. In fact, in Washington State, we are looking at the foundational approach to a road charge being a simple odometer read that could be self-reported by drivers online when they go to renew their vehicle tabs, making it very easy for drivers to comply. But also there are ways you could use technology to support that and make it easy for drivers through either taking a photo of your odometer and texting it in. So there are ways to validate and ensure there's not tax evasion associated with self-reporting. It does happen to be also the most effective, cost-effective and efficient way of doing it. So we feel that it's a foundational, important point that drivers have the choice between if they'd like to use GPS or a technology approach or their vehicle's telematics to remit their miles, or if they would like to go with a more what we call manual approach of simply reporting your odometer. This gives drivers the opportunity to customize how they would participate, and it removes the concerns that many would have utilizing GPS.
Well, thanks for that. I'd like to shift to Mr. Strickler in the time that I have left and ask about a different topic, the August redistribution process, which I know is a concern to a lot of state DOTs. I've heard it from my state too. I know that AASHTO has been engaged in conversations with Federal Highway to modernize this redistribution process. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts in the remaining time?
Absolutely, and I'll be brief as well. I think the greatest concern for state DOTs is being able to actually obligate and spend the funds that come in through the redistribution process. So I think my primary comment would be to ensure that we can obligate it under a timely fashion as opposed to all upfront.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. I was noting different taxes that my colleague from Washington was talking about a while ago here. And California, indeed, my home state, has the highest gas tax, highest car tax, highest cap and trade, carbon tax, and the highest income tax, pretty much. So it's a lot of laughs when we talk about having to raise something and take that back to my home state. But anyway, I do want to point out for heavy-duty trucks and trailer vehicles that there's a federal excise tax specific to them of 12% on a new vehicle, 12%. Now, we want to promote newer, cleaner burning, safer, better trucks to be on our highways, and so the disincentive for that is to hit them for a 12% tax on the purchase of that new vehicle. And as we note with the other forms of taxation with the Highway Trust Fund, there's a user pay, user benefit aspect to all the other different forms of it. And this one here is not a user pay, user benefit, because it's indeed hit every time you buy one of those new vehicles, if you should choose to do so. And also we see that it's cyclical because of truck sales are going to be more or less move with the economy, move with the amount of goods that are going into a particular time. Like truck sales weren't great during the COVID fiasco, so it's not not a source of funding that is constant or steady as it might be more so on other forms. So I think it's very important that when we have this discussion here on the Highway Trust Fund and the continuity of the revenue on that, we also look at a way to relieve the burden on people that would buy new trucks and check out my bill, HR 1440, that would remove that tax and distribute that burden over a wider population. So indeed, with it being inconsistent like that, you really can't count on what's going to be in the trust fund. I think that's a big thrust of what we're trying to do here today in this conversation. So I want to pose this to Ms. Griffiths and Mr. Strickler. At the state level, as you implement transportation projects, how important is it to have the consistency of funding when planning projects that use funds out of the Highway Trust Fund?
As it relates to consistency and reliability in the funding, I think I can say pretty directly that it's really important that we rely on that. I often say that we have a long time frame on our transportation projects. Sometimes they take much longer than most folks would anticipate. A lot of processes involved in making sure that we get it right, and so that consistency and reliability is extremely important for us as we deliver our program.
3 minutes flew by. Ms. Griffith, you want to touch on it? Just a
Quick answer, Ms. Griffith.
Yes, it is important to be consistent when we have a number of projects that we consider mega projects that go on for years and years. The cyclical funding and flow of funds is critical to ensuring that we are delivering them efficiently. So delays in that funding ultimately result in cost increases on the bottom line of the delivery.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields, Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Shirley, in your testimony, you highlight that the projected balances in both the highway and transit accounts of the Highway Trust Fund will be exhausted in 2028. Your projections indicate that accumulated shortfall will be $241 billion over 2024 through 2033. I know there's a variety of options that Congress can take to close this funding gap. I have introduced H.R. 3360, the National Infrastructure Investment Corporation Act of 2023, with Representative Webster, as he touched on it earlier, to establish a national infrastructure bank to help leverage private dollars and provide local governments with another financing tool for necessary infrastructure projects. I know there are existing financing programs like TIFIA and the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing RRIF program. What do you think the advantages of having an infrastructure bank would be?
So as you pointed out, there are different financing mechanisms in place to potentially either assist states or to assist private entities that are interested in participating in financing highway infrastructure. Depending on how it was implemented, I haven't had a chance to take a look at the details of your legislation. You'd be sort of shifting the decision-making responsibility in terms of where projects would be funded, which projects would be financed, away from either necessarily the state and local governments or from the Department of Transportation. So I know that certainly would be a difference with a National Infrastructure Bank. And then I think it would depend on the incentives that you have in place for sort of additional participation in it in terms of tax preferences or in terms of other funds being provided to it.
Thank you. Mr. Strickler, one of the biggest obstacles to addressing the projected shortfalls for the Highway Trust Fund and finding alternative sources of revenue is educating the public about the need for a new idea or approach. How have you handled educating the public in Oregon?
Congressman, thank you for that question. Frankly, we've been out having detailed conversation, not just about what the incoming revenue is, but what we're buying for that revenue. So I think part of the actual conversation has to entail what the public gets. We've long been an industry that serves for the things that we build, and we need to have a focus on the people. I would say that as we looked at our RUC program, for example, some lessons learned there would be having more detailed conversation with the public so that they understand the complexities of highway funding and transportation funding across the board, because frankly, the public doesn't understand all of the different revenue streams that we have, and then how then that could benefit them in conversion to a RUC. So I would say increased communication.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Owens.
Thank you, Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Holmes, and all witnesses today that we have the opportunity to learn, listen, and discuss the Highway Trust Fund. America's highway system has long been the foundation of a robust economy growth, job creation, and interstate commerce that's produced the quality of life that Americans have come to expect as normal. This infrastructure has been foundational to our prosperity as goods, services, and people move rapidly across our 2,800-mile span of our nation. However, with each passing year, we need to modernize how we fund this critical infrastructure asset as it grows more urgent. I do know that the answer is not simply raising federal fuel tax. As cars become more efficient and more Americans switch to electric vehicles, revenue sources are decreasing and maintenance costs increasing. What we do know is a short-term injection of government funds cannot continue to be the solution, nor the increase of taxes, which disproportionately affect the poor and middle-class families who are unable to afford top-dollar EVs. For this reason, I look forward to learning from the day's witnesses and moving this subcommittee closer to getting a consensus the American people and our constituents expected. Thank you, first of all, for your opening statements, and forgive me for any redundancy, but there's one area that I did have some concerns about. So I have one question really for Mrs. Strickler and Mrs. Griffin. Much of my district is disproportionately affected by increase of fuel tax due to the long distances my rural constituents have to travel for basic goods and services. These tens of thousands of constituents are certainly not going to be buying the EVs. From solutions you have considered, how do you bridge the urban-rural divide to ensure rural Americans are not footing the bill? Ms. Griffin, why don't you start off, please?
Thank you for the question. We have looked at options to mitigate potential negative financial impacts on rural drivers, recognizing they do put on more miles than their urban counterparts. I will note suburban drivers with their long commutes into city centers where they work also put on significant miles as well. So long miles, total miles per year is a concern in general when you think about charging by the mile. Our lawmakers are considering approaches that we have recommended, potential, again, levers that the road charge provides that we don't have with the gas tax, such as thinking about either, again, capping total amounts that you could accrue in a year. So if you drove 20,000 miles and potentially faced let's say $500 or $600 in rec charges, the state legislature or Congress could certainly put a cap and say, well, you'll never be liable for anything over 300. So it provides that level of certainty. We've also looked at ways of a tiered approach of rec rates. So you might think about portions of miles, say anything up to 5,000 miles, you pay one rate, 5 to 10,000, and so on. And you start creating a tiered rec system where drivers have that certainty and perhaps get a cost break as they drive further. So those are just a couple of ideas.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'll yield back my time.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Menendez.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to echo the ranking member's comments about continuing to fund mass transit, which so many of my residents, constituents rely on, and I believe we need to continue to heavily invest in throughout the country, but specifically in New Jersey's 8th Congressional District. In addition to my home state of New Jersey, most of our roads and bridges were built over 100 years ago. The American Society of Civil Engineers found that 57% of our roads are in poor or fair condition. In a recent article, it was cited that the most heavily traveled structurally deficient bridge in the state of New Jersey is the Route 495 East Bridge that carries traffic to the Lincoln Tunnel over Route 3. Built in 1951, it is used by over 137,000 vehicles a day. So this is critically important that we continue to fund these projects. Capital projects are critical for my state and district to repair our deteriorating infrastructure. Mr. Strickler, how does the Highway Trust Fund help state DOTs plan for capital projects to improve infrastructure, even when the federal budget and therefore the future of federal grant programs is uncertain?
Congressman, I would say that the most important aspect is it allows us to plan over longer periods of time. And so the contract authority that comes with the Highway Trust Fund allows us to project into the future the projects that are coming down the pike. I will say that, as you've just described. I think every state has difficulties in funding some of their larger projects, and that will continue. But funding all of the system on the transit side as well as the roadway improvement side and preservation, I'll assert, in a project like you just described, is vitally important. If we don't have the long-term contract authority that allows us to extend beyond a year or two, then it's much more difficult to plan for those projects because they do take quite a bit of time and a considerable amount of public dialogue to make sure that we get them right.
Absolutely. We're seeing that right now in New Jersey with a plan that the state DOT has. There's community input, there's planning, there's environmental considerations, right? So we're talking about years of planning. That planning includes a significant amount of money that goes into the planning, not just the construction. So we're talking about a minimum 5 to 7 years for any project of this size and scale.
That's correct, and I'm aware of other projects that take even longer. And again, part of the dialogue really does inform what the right outcome is, because these investments will be in place for a century. And so as we look
If done
to get
properly and
Yeah.
planned properly, exactly. Just
Correct.
to sum it up quickly, what would eliminating the Highway Trust Fund mean for states' ability to plan multi-year transportation projects?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning.
Sure. What would eliminating the Highway Trust Fund mean for states' ability to plan multi-year transportation projects?
Great question. It would be extremely detrimental because it would limit our ability to plan into the future and start some of the projects that take those multi-year investments in time and energy and communication with the public.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Davis, I thought one of the most striking parts of your testimony was walking through the fact that by 2026, the deficit in the trust fund is going to be 40% a year. That's how upside down we are. And of course, getting much, much worse in the out years. You talk about potential replacement revenues. You mentioned vehicle miles traveled. That's been a big discussion today. Are there technical reasons why we don't talk more about a pay-at-the-pump approach? I mean, that's what works for gasoline. What technically means that can't work at the charger?
You mean only electric vehicles or all vehicles?
Well, clearly pay at the pump already works for the internal combustion engine. Why can't that same mechanism work for EVs at the charging stations?
It can. The problem is that the majority of EV charging is done at home. So it's a question of how do you tell how much of the kilowatt hours from your utility bill are going to charging your car versus other things. And right now, that's only possible if you install a very expensive sub-meter in your home. Who's going to pay for that? And so that is the issue. There are also potential privacy issues on looking at that. So that is the biggest holdup. But pay at the pump at a public charging station is certainly consistent with the use pay principle.
But you talk expensive infrastructure and privacy, but don't we have those same concerns that a vehicle miles travel? I mean, you're going to have technology in the vehicle if it's really on the basis of how many miles they're driving, right? That's got to be hardware and software, and that's certainly a privacy concern.
You can. There's about 5 different ways that states have found to build the route. There's onboard telematics in the car. That has privacy issues. There's that little OBD port by your left knee. You can put a little box in there with or without GPS. So it can either just track miles or GPS. And of course, these, we're all giving our privacy location away to, Apple and Microsoft already. Or just a simple odometer readings, either at your state annual inspection or on a voluntary basis. So there are 3 or 4 ways of doing it, either with or without GPS in each area. So that so far it's been up to states, and most states are offering multiple options to participate in the VMT pilot as their choice.
And of course, to the extent that everybody paying at the pump still puts us into a 40% deficit, everybody paying at the pump or the charger, however they're doing it, doesn't fill the void. I mean, you say that if we can't fix it, we really need to end it. That's a pretty dramatic suggestion, isn't it?
It's budgetarily honest. If you're going to keep $43 billion a year is what the current taxes are bringing in indefinitely, and we're spending $77 a year right now is the new contract authority for FY24. So if you cannot take 43 up or bring 77 down, then at least just have the general fund money appropriated through the regular budget process instead of these off-budget transfers into the trust fund.
And my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Norton. It's a pleasure to be here today. In discussing the funding structure of the Highway Trust Fund and how it should adapt to progress in the transportation industry, we're getting to an important underlying question about the direction of the Highway Trust Fund itself. As we heard from our witnesses, the Highway Trust Fund was created in 1956. The most recent structural changes were in 1982 when the current 80-20 split was established. That is, 80% for highways and 20% for public transit. So to summarize, we have a 40-year-old structure couched in a 70-year-old paradigm that is still dictating the present and future funding priorities of our nation's transportation system. Those outdated paradigms have proven inadequate. They've contributed to crumbling public transit, sprawl, and traffic congestion, and they're at odds with the ongoing and necessary push toward multimodal transportation. Since communities of color and low-income people disproportionately rely on public transit, supporting car alternatives is a matter of racial equity and economic opportunity. So, getting back to the HTF, since 2008, it's been sustained through a series of general fund transfers rather than user fees. That means that taxpayer dollars are supporting a fund whose outdated paradigms are increasingly at odds with the needs of communities across the country. My question here is for you, Ms. Griffith. Earlier this year, Washington State DOT Secretary Roger Millar said at an AASHTO conference, quote, "There's no way that we can grow our highway system to keep up with increasing congestion, so we need to think about our transportation infrastructure in smarter ways, ways to get more out of what we have. When we need to add capacity, we need to be strategic about it and multimodal about it." End of quote. My question is this: how would shifting the funding split in the Highway Trust Fund toward transit and active transportation investments and less toward highways positively help accomplish the goals of Secretary Millar, what he laid out?
Thank you for the question. While I cannot speak to Secretary Millar's comments, I do believe that there are opportunities to think about creating a funding system for the future transportation system, and I think your points are well taken. What the right mix or percentage splits are, I think, is something I would leave to the deliberation of Congress to determine. I do believe, though, that when we think about funding, sustainability is the first and foremost decision point and action that needs to happen. We need to get money in the coffers, right? And then we can debate and discuss how we distribute and use those dollars. So for us, the priority is to first create a sustainable funding source, like road usage charging, so that we at least resolve the threat to the revenue coming in, and then we can shift to how we're going to allocate.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Gentleman yields, Mr. Yocum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I believe our true north for infrastructure funding should be a user-pays system with no general fund transfers. I don't know that a silver bullet exists that immediately gets us to that, but I do believe that that should always be our guiding principle as we seek to chip away at that gap. Electric vehicles aren't covered by existing fuel taxes, and so 33 states have instituted annual electric vehicle registration fees in an attempt to capture that lost gas tax revenue. My home state of Indiana charges $150. Mr. Strickler's home state of Oregon charges $110. And Ms. Griffith's home state of Washington charges $225. Dr. Shirley, your testimony indicates a $100 federal EV registration fee would raise about $2 billion, which would put roughly on par with the heavy vehicle use taxes contribution to the Federal Highway Trust Fund. Again, I'm not talking about silver bullets here. Mr. Strickler and Ms. Griffith, do you agree that your state's registration fees ensure electric vehicles pay their fair share of infrastructure funding? Mr. Strickler.
Congressman, I would say that our states and our legislature has recognized that paying the fair share is an important question, and they have acted accordingly.
Great, thank you. And Ms. Griffith?
I would say it depends on the use of the roadway, right? And that's why we have seen Plug in America, Seattle Electric Vehicle Association, and others advocate for road usage charging over these flat fees to ensure that they do pay for the roads they
Great,
use.
thank you. And in either of your opinions, have these fees prevented or slowed electric vehicle adoption, starting with you, Mr. Strickler?
I don't think they have slowed the adoption.
Great, thank you. And Ms. Griffith?
Yeah, I don't think there is any correlating data that would suggest that.
Great. The Sierra Club has said that these fees are being pushed by Big Oil. Mr. Strickler, did Big Oil play a role in influencing Oregon to adopt its EV registration fee?
That's actually not a question that I can answer cohesively. I wasn't here in 2017 as they passed the legislation, but they did recognize, frankly, that the cost overall for EV registration should be commensurate with the use, and did their very best to make that calculation.
And Ms. Griffith, do you believe that Big Oil played a role in ensuring that Washington, in your state, instituted these fees?
I cannot speak to the intent of why the legislature enacted the fee, although I can say that they have dedicated those funds to purposes to support electric vehicle charging.
Thank you. And very briefly, there was an article in the Washington Post the other day, and its premise is that electric vehicle registration fees are nothing more than a Republican tool in the culture wars. Mr. Strickler, are these a Republican tool in the culture wars? Is this part of the culture wars in your state, in Oregon?
I would say my state tackled it from the position of equity, recognizing that each of the different vehicles should pay their fair share.
And Ms. Griffith, was this part of the Republican culture wars in your
Quick
state?
answer.
Yes or
Quick
no?
answer, Ms. Griffith.
I believe that the electric vehicle fee was put in place to provide funding for EV infrastructure.
Thank you. I'm glad we can clear that up, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for having this important hearing on the Highway Trust Fund. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, we voted to invest in our highways and transit, putting important resources in the Highway Trust Fund and other transportation programs. That was necessary, and we are already seeing such positive impact in our communities. But even with this investment, my home state of Arizona is doing more with less, as the current funding formulas continue to rely on the woefully outdated census data from 2000 and traffic volumes from that same period. This disproportionately impacts states like Arizona and the Phoenix metro region, which has the highest population growth in the country. Tying these 20-year-old population numbers to investments for the next 5 years hinders our ability to tackle our significant and growing infrastructure needs, like the expansion of I-10. Federal legislation should reflect current conditions and be responsive to the needs of fast-growing states like Arizona, which has experienced huge population growth, more than 2 million people just since 2000. Mr. Stickler, as you know, the federal highway formulas that distribute funding from the Highway Trust Fund have not been changed for over 20 years. This means states like mine that continue to see tremendous increases in our population do not receive funding from the Highway Trust Fund that reflects this growth. How do you suggest we adjust funding formulas to account for population growth to keep up with the rate of inflation and rising construction costs?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I'd submit that the actual equation and split is probably more something for Congress to negotiate. But I will say that every transportation department across the country needs more revenue. And so in order for us to keep pace with what we have for a deterioration of assets, we do need more, whatever the equation ends up being.
Should we be using the most recent census data in federal highway funding formulas? Please.
I'm sorry?
Please. Should we be using the most recent census data in federal highway formulas?
Again, I would probably defer that to Congress to come up with the most equitable form.
Okay. I want to thank my colleague, thank you. My colleagues in the Senate, including Senator Kelly, have been working on language to study the formula and modernize it, and I appreciate those efforts. I look forward to working with the committee on the solvency issue of the highway trust funds and the issue of the inequity for fast-growing states like Arizona, where we have to keep up with that growth and having funding formulas that keep up with modernized information on census and population. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Griffith, I have a question. Do you drive a electric vehicle for your personal use?
No, I do not.
Okay. One of the concerns I have about the infrastructure requirements for electric vehicles is actually the charging infrastructure. And obviously, that's different than weight on the roads and repairing the roads. But when we think about a vehicle usage tax, has anyone given consideration to the electrical infrastructure that's required is there any taxing mechanism considered in vehicle use to augment and offset the cost of the changing in our power generation and distribution system for electric vehicles? Is anyone aware of any studies along those lines? Yep, I'm surprised. That's a huge multi-trillion-dollar investment that's required to see electric vehicles come to fruition. Ms. Griffin, do you share your location data? Currently, for example, like in your phone, would you feel comfortable sharing all of your transportation, your movement data? For example, with the tax authority?
Yes, I would. I share it with private companies, and I would trust sharing it with the government as well.
That's fascinating. I think very few of your fellow citizens would share that enthusiasm for sharing private data with the federal government. The essence of the VMT requires that this kind of personal and private information be shared with our tax authorities. In fact, with very little data, even without real-time GPS data, using artificial intelligence, you can actually correlate persons' habits. You can predict where they will be. You can predict where they go to church. You can predict where their children go to school, where they shop. All of these things, even with what's called metadata or just high-level information from from this. And I think it's a great concern. Dr. Shirley, one of the things that I've seen from your chart, which I really appreciated, is the increase of subsidies and shortfalls that have been added since 2007. And those seem to only get larger and larger. This seems unsustainable. And it seems like electric vehicles are accelerating that or exacerbating that. As you look at your chart, do you have concern that the federal government will perhaps stop providing these kinds of subsidies?
Quick answer, Dr. Shirley.
Certainly agree that the shortfalls are increasing. I don't know, that will be something for you and your colleagues to work through how best to handle the shortfall and the discrepancies between revenues and outlays.
Thank you for your time.
Gentleman yields, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Davis, I haven't had an opportunity to go through all of your data here, but you mentioned that one of the, number 3, that Congress failed to cut spending or increase tax rates to compensate for these trends. Just a quick cursory look on Google at a couple different sources. It looks like 3 cents in 1956 would be at 30 cents today. With inflation, there's 2 or 3 different sources, and they all come to about the same conclusion. Have you done any work on that, and would that be about the right level?
It depends if you're looking at the way it feels to the consumer, which is CPI, but that doesn't tell you much about the price of actually building of asphalt and concrete. So it peaked when Eisenhower raised it to 4 cents in 59.
Right.
That was, in purchasing power, that was about 70 cents equal today because of construction cost inflation.
Well, let's just assume 10, that's about 2/3. That'd be 18 is what we're at now, give or take. That'd be up 12, that's 2/3 of what it is now. If you had 2/3 more money in that fund, we'd be okay, would we not? Because I think we have 40 right now.
Yes.
Yeah, so the problem is Congress. And Jim Oberstar, if he was still here, we wouldn't have had this problem. If he wasn't here and he was a one-man government, we wouldn't have this problem.
Well, if he were still here, it would be in the 4th hour of this hearing. But,
but we'd learn a lot. A lot of opportunities. We passed, I think, in this committee to fund the highway fund with Oberstar, an increase in the tax in the gas tax. That's the last time I think we did it.
Well, but again, as I recall, Mr. Rangel was then chairman of Ways and Means and was not as completely on board with the idea as this committee was, and the buck stops over at Longworth with them. So that was part of the problem, is that this committee controls the spending side of the trust fund, but Ways and Means controls the revenue side. So when they disagree.
Well, the bottom line is, if Congress would have kept the gas tax at the rate it was when it was initiated, we would have been okay. So it's a problem.
If it had been indexed for any kind of inflation from the beginning, yes, we would still be fine.
And I understand people are fearful of raising taxes and all that, but it was a duty and responsibility we should have had in this committee at least to get it going. Let me ask you this, maybe Ms. Griffith, about the idea of taxing based on miles, and I understand that too, but isn't there a difference in the damage that cars do based on their size?
So at least for state highways, they are engineered to carry the weight of about 10,000 pounds or under. So it is de minimis to think about in terms of weight for the passenger fleet. However, it certainly could be a proxy of rate setting where you set rates by weight to accommodate or cover those cost impacts.
Is the diesel tax compared to the gas tax appropriately different to compensate for how much a truck would damage the roads as distinguished from a Mini Cooper?
From a context purpose, it appears it would be so given it's higher. I think there would have to be further research, and it's probably been done on what a correlating rate would need to be for the heavier vehicles.
Mr. Crawford, thank you for scheduling this hearing, and thank you all for attending.
You bet. Gentleman yields, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm on a fact-finding mission, so most of my questions are just asking, trying to get some information with me personally since I'm in this industry and pay taxes. Right now, we pay 24 cents a gallon on fuel taxes. FET tax is usually about $15,000 per truck on new trucks. Federal highway use tax, $550 per truck per year. And then we have international registration plan for our tags to pay for, which is about $1,300 per truck. And then since I own over 100 trucks, I have to join the UCR, which is the Universal Carrier Registration Program, which costs me around $4,000 a year. That adds up to over $10,000 per truck per year right now that I pay in taxes. So I guess my question, I want to ask Dr. Shirley, the Highway Trust Fund, is it only made up of fuel tax or are any of these other taxes included?
I mean, there are these additional taxes on heavy trucks, heavy vehicles, like you were saying. I believe they comprise those additional taxes outside of the fuel taxes.
I guess what I'm asking, what's the Highway Trust Fund made up of? Just fuel tax? I mean, that's all we're talking about.
No, more than fuel tax. Those other.
So it's all these taxes combined?
I'm not familiar with the UCR program, but other than that, yes.
Okay. All right. So we got that over. Does the fuel tax pay for anything besides roads and bridges? Or this Highway Trust Fund? Is it for just roads and bridges, or does it cover mass transit, bike paths, sidewalks?
Yes, it covers transit account as well. Funds go into that, and
But we're going to look at making the deficit up on the back of truckers across this country. Is that what we're saying? I'm just asking.
I can speak to how the revenues are coming in now and decisions about how best.
Is that what
to
we're
address the
looking at? That's
shortfalls.
all I'm hearing is fuel tax, correct? On diesel.
I had-
Bicycles don't use diesel fuel, do they?
I had a chance
People
to
don't buy
speak
diesel
to
to ride the bus or mass transit.
VMT fees
Okay.
or.
So I guess,
EV
and
fees
here's
as
my
well.
last question for you. When y'all are looking at these analyses and we have these deficits, are we taking into any account how much extra that the federal government costs these projects just in the delays that they cause with the EPA and all these other federal agencies that are out of control and cause a 2-year program to go to a 20-year program or project?
There's some context in which we've started to take a preliminary work.
So I would
look
say
at
the
issues
federal
related to
government is a
permitting.
large part of the problem that we
We've not-
have with it. We spend too much money in the federal government now, and a lot of it is causing the private sector to spend more money as well just to get our roads and bridges up to standards. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields, Ms. Foshee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Holmes Norton for holding this hearing today, and to the witnesses. In the interest of time, I will simply ask one question and ask each of you to respond. Would you agree that investing in railway systems would alleviate the burden on the Highway Trust Fund to sufficiently serve every state?
Could you say it again, please, ma'am?
Again, would you agree that investing in railway systems, if that would alleviate the burden on the Highway Trust Fund to sufficiently serve every state?
I don't know that, again, if you're talking intercity passenger rail like Amtrak or rail-based mass transit systems within an urban area, but either way, it doesn't really change the fundamental revenue problem that we're only taking in 43 from user taxes, $1 billion a year, and we're paying 76, 77 billion a year on something. And whether you switch that something from being highways and mass transit to railroads or whatever, as the Senate voted back in 97 or 98 to actually dedicate a half cent of the gas tax to railroads, to Amtrak, and that got lost in conference. So, but whatever you're spending it on, it doesn't really matter because that's not going to bring any more revenue to that 43 billion a year number. And as long as we're running that systemic deficit, I'm not sure how it balances out.
Would anyone else like to respond? Thank you.
Does the gentlewoman yield?
She does. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman, Mr. Duarte.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I represent a rural district just outside of the San Francisco Bay Area, and we have quite a few commuters, lower income commuters that go back and forth. And I'm very, very concerned that a mile formula will quickly evolve into a congestion pricing formula to disadvantage lower income commuters from getting to the optimal jobs and at the optimal times they need to be there. Do any of you have quick comments, because I have another question, on where commuter pricing, congestion pricing is impacted and being utilized, and how we can make sure that if we go to a miles traveled formula, we don't invite a congestion pricing mechanism to quickly follow?
I will just say in Washington State, my organization is the toll authority for the state, and we've recommended that tolling and road usage charge remain separate. Road usage charge is being looked at as a foundational replacement for the statewide system, replacing the gas tax. So we do not recommend they be mixed or utilized in the same way.
So I agree with my Congresswoman Chavez DeRemer on tolling. I'm against that too. Mr. Strickler, are American taxpayers getting a bang for the buck for the dollars we do put into highway travel miles? I know the Infrastructure Transportation Jobs Act commingles funding with a lot of the Highway Trust Fund funding. We've got DEI contracting requirements, carbon neutral requirements, made in the USA requirements, on top of already established prevailing wage and NEPA requirements. Compared to inflation, what is the cost of a freeway mile done in the last 30 years compared to the Consumer Price Index?
Yeah, Congressman, I might be able to give you a better answer based upon our Oregon experience and some of our state funding than what we've seen. As we look at the most recent major investment in transportation in 2017 in Oregon, what we see is that just the inflationary time period from then till now, the dollar buys less today, even after the increase in funding that came in House Bill 2017. So we are seeing an impact. But that impact, I think, creates an important question about how much we're investing overall and the sustainability of those revenue streams coming in.
Thank you. Mr. Davis, do you have comments on that? What's the cost of a highway travel mile, a highway mile, doing in the last 7 or 8 years or the last 20 years, whatever perspective you can give us there?
The Federal Highway Administration publishes a quarterly National Highway Construction Cost Index, NHCCI, ever since 2003. And after a long lull, unfortunately, that index has risen almost 50% since the fourth quarter of 2020. There were some supply chain issues, but also just there's only so much capacity in gravel pits and steel mills and cement kilns at any one time, and some of the upfront money in the IIJA may have pushed that capacity a bit.
Do you believe that the social justice contracting requirements, the carbon neutrality requirements, the Made in the USA requirements are factored in completely to the current cost structure that you're referring to?
Somewhat. I believe so far that the Buy America is probably much more significant than the other one you mentioned, at least right now. But yeah, there are significant issues with the Buy America requirements for construction materials in the IIJA that the administration and the industry are still working through.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Let me thank the witnesses for being here today and for your flexibility. We greatly appreciate it. We've been able to, I think, jam about 50 pounds of back and forth into a 10-pound bag, so we appreciate it. And I thank the ranking member for her willingness to be so flexible, and to the members as well. So seeing no further questions from the members, this concludes our hearing today. We'd like to thank each of you again, and the committee stands adjourned.